Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. The air in this ancient temple courtyard hangs thick with incense, frankincense and myrrh mixing with the earthy smell of wet clay bricks drying in Mesopotamian heat. You stand at the threshold of the oldest stories humanity ever bothered to preserve, stories carved into tablets when writing itself was barely an infant technology, when each cuneiform wedge represented not just a sound, but an act of cosmic record-keeping. The ziggurat looms behind you, its mud brick tiers climbing toward a sky that hasn't yet learned the names we'll give its constellations. Somewhere in the distance, the Euphrates whispers secrets to the reeds, secrets about what came before, about the empty epoch when gods hadn't yet decided humanity was worth the trouble. This is where it gets interesting, and slightly dangerous for your comfortable worldview. You probably won't survive this journey with your understanding of ancient history intact, because what we're about to explore lives in that fascinating territory between archaeological fact and fringe speculation, between what scholars agree happened and what makes absolutely no sense unless you're willing to entertain some genuinely weird possibilities. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not interested in guilt-tripping you into clicking buttons, but if this kind of deep dive into humanity's oldest mythology speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn to these liminal spaces where history dissolves into myth, and myth hardens back into something that might have been real, then maybe stick around. And if you feel like sharing where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, drop a comment. There's something beautifully surreal about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, across time zones, gathered around the same ancient campfire of human imagination. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The empty epoch. That's what some researchers call it, though that's not an official term you'll find in any mainstream textbook. It's the period before the Anunnaki descended, before the gods made themselves known, before the divine intervention that Sumerian texts describe with such matter-of-fact precision it's almost unsettling. We're talking about a time that exists in negative space, defined entirely by what came after it, like the silence before a symphony begins. The Sumerians themselves seemed almost uninterested in this pre-divine era, mentioning it only in passing, as if it were too empty, too formless, too lacking in the drama that makes stories worth telling to bother with extensive detail. But that absence itself tells us something, doesn't it? The fact that they began their cosmic histories not with the Earth's creation but with the arrival of beings from elsewhere suggests a worldview fundamentally different from our modern assumptions about how civilizations develop. Let me paint you a picture of what we think, and I use that word generously, the world looked like in this empty epoch. Imagine southern Mesopotamia around 5000 BCE, give or take a millennium, because dating these prehistorical periods is about as precise as throwing darts at a calendar while blindfolded and slightly dizzy. The land between the rivers hasn't yet become the cradle of civilization, hasn't yet earned that pretentious title history teachers love to throw around. It's marshland mostly, with reed beds stretching to the horizon, interrupted by occasional islands of slightly higher ground where early settlements cluster like nervous children afraid to venture too far from home. The people here are hunter-gatherers transitioning to agriculture, figuring out that if you deliberately plant seeds instead of just hoping they'll grow on their own, you get more reliable food sources. Revolutionary stuff, really, though it takes them several centuries to fully commit to the concept. These Proto-Sumerians, and calling them that, is already problematic, because we don't know if they're actually the ancestors of the people we'll later identify as Sumerian, or if they're a completely different population that got replaced or absorbed, live in small communities of maybe 50 to 200 people. Their houses are simple reed structures, the kind that last maybe a generation before needing complete rebuilding, which is perfect if you're not particularly attached to the idea of permanent architecture. They make pottery, though not the wheel-thrown kind you're thinking of, because the potter's wheel won't be invented for another 1,000 years or so, which means every vessel is hand-built, coiled, pinched into shape with the patience of people who don't yet have television to distract them from the meditative rhythm of ceramic creation. The pottery they produce is actually quite beautiful in its simplicity. Buff-colored clay decorated with geometric patterns in dark paint, patterns that might mean something symbolic or might just be what looked cool to the person making them. Archaeologists love to attribute deep meaning to everything ancient people created, as if our ancestors never did anything just because it looked nice. Here's where it gets weird, and by weird I mean this is where the fringe theories start having a field day with what we find in the archaeological record. Some researchers, and I'm using that term loosely to include both credentialed academics and enthusiastic amateurs with YouTube channels and questionable research methodologies, point to an apparent discontinuity in the cultural development of southern Mesopotamia. They observe that around 4000 BCE there's a sudden leap in technological sophistication, in social organization, in the complexity of religious practices that seems disproportionate to the gradual evolution we'd expect from a Neolithic society slowly figuring things out. Mainstream archaeology explains this through normal processes of cultural development, trade networks, gradual accumulation of knowledge, the kind of rational explanations that make sense if you believe human progress moves in relatively predictable patterns. But the fringe interpretations, oh, they love this discontinuity. They see it as evidence of outside intervention, of knowledge being introduced rather than developed, of the Anunnaki arrival being not mythological but historical, just dressed up in the language of gods and heavens because ancient people lacked the vocabulary to describe what they were actually witnessing. Now, before you roll your eyes so hard they achieve escape velocity, let's acknowledge something that mainstream scholarship actually agrees on. The Sumerian king list, one of our most important textual sources for early Mesopotamian history, absolutely describes kingship as descending from heaven. The text, preserved in multiple copies dating from around 2000 BCE but referencing much earlier periods, opens with the phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Not after humans developed political structures, or after people figured out they needed leaders, but after it descended, past tense, completed action, from above. The Sumerians present this as straightforward historical fact, as unremarkable as saying, after the river flooded, or after the harvest came. They're not using metaphorical language or poetic flourish, at least not in any way that's obvious to us reading these texts 4,000 years later through multiple layers of translation and cultural disconnect. Eridu. Let's talk about Eridu for a moment, because this city occupies a special place in Sumerian cosmology and, conveniently, in our story tonight. Archaeological excavations at the site, located in what's now southern Iraq, about 12 miles southwest of the ziggurat at reveal settlement layers dating back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in Mesopotamia. The mainstream historical fact, the one you can find in any respectable textbook without getting laughed out of academic conferences, is that Eridu was considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever created, the place where civilization began, the original template for urban existence. The city was dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, water, creation, and intelligence, whose temple, the Iabzu, or House of the Cosmic Waters, became the most important religious structure in early Sumerian religion. The temple complex at Eridu went through 18 distinct rebuilding phases over the millennia, each new temple built directly on top of its predecessor, creating an archaeological layer cake that tells the story of continuous religious devotion spanning thousands of years. But here's the quirky interpretation that makes archaeologists uncomfortable at dinner parties. Some researchers point out that the earliest temple structure at Eridu, dating to around 5000 BCE, is far more sophisticated than the domestic architecture of the same period. It's larger, more carefully planned, built with more attention to astronomical alignment, its corners oriented to the cardinal directions with precision that suggests either advanced surveying knowledge or, if you're feeling conspiratorial, guidance from beings with better understanding of celestial mechanics than Neolithic farmers should possess. The mainstream explanation is that even early societies could develop specialized knowledge and dedicate extra resources to religious structures because that's what humans do. We build impressive things for our gods even when we're still figuring out basic agriculture. The fringe interpretation whispers about the structure being designed according to specifications provided by the very beings who would be worshipped there, a cosmic chicken and egg problem that makes my brain itch. You can imagine the scholarly debates this generates, can't you? Picture a conference room full of academics with too much coffee and not enough sleep, arguing passionately about whether a slightly larger building foundation proves anything about divine intervention. One camp insists that exceptional doesn't mean extraterrestrial, that humans are perfectly capable of innovation without needing gods or ancient astronauts to hold their hands. The other camp points to the persistent global traditions of knowledge-bringing beings descending from the heavens and asks why we're so quick to dismiss these stories as pure mythology when they appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Both camps think the other is missing something obvious, and both are probably right, which is the frustrating beauty of archaeology. The past never gives us quite enough evidence to be certain about anything. The empty epoch, according to Sumerian cosmology, ends not with a gradual transition, but with a definitive event, the arrival of the Anunnaki. The word itself appears throughout Sumerian and later Akkadian texts, referring to a group of deities who, in the earliest sources, are simply described as those who from heaven to earth came. The texts are maddeningly vague about the specifics. Ancient Sumerians apparently assumed their readers already knew who the Anunnaki were and didn't need extensive exposition, which is incredibly inconvenient for us trying to understand their worldview 4 millennia later. What we know is that these beings established themselves as rulers over early humanity, that they built the first cities, that they taught the arts of civilization, that they created or modified humans for purposes that different texts describe differently, leading to all sorts of fascinating inconsistencies that keep scholars employed trying to reconcile contradictory source material. The landscape of pre-divine Mesopotamia stretches before you in your mind's eye, flat and featureless under a sky that knows nothing of temples or ziggurats or the elaborate cosmologies that will someday be written about it. The rivers flow, indifferent to whether gods exist or not, carving their channels through alluvial deposits, flooding seasonally, creating the fertile conditions that will eventually support the world's first urban civilization. Wild barley grows in patches, not yet domesticated, not yet the basis of bread and beer and the entire Sumerian economy. Gazelles migrate through the grasslands, birds wheel overhead, their calls the only voices in a world that hasn't yet invented language complex enough to name them. It's peaceful, in its way, this empty epoch. Peaceful like a blank page is peaceful, full of potential but empty of meaning, waiting for someone to come along and write the first word. Some researchers love to point out the flood geology of southern Mesopotamia and connect it to the various flood myths that permeate Sumerian literature. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s, suggests that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea catastrophically breached into the Black Sea basin, raising water levels dramatically and flooding extensive coastal settlements. While this event occurred north of Mesopotamia, some theorists propose similar flooding events in the Persian Gulf, suggesting that the empty epoch might have ended quite literally with a deluge that reshaped both the landscape and human society, a cataclysm so profound it got remembered in the cultural memory as divine intervention. The mainstream archaeological community remains skeptical of connecting specific geological events to mythological narratives, pointing out that flood stories are nearly universal in human cultures because, surprise, floods are a common natural disaster that terrifies people everywhere. But the fringe interpretations whisper about pre-flood civilizations, about advanced knowledge lost in ancient cataclysms, about the Anunnaki arriving specifically in response to such disasters to help humanity rebuild, or, in darker versions of the theory, to take advantage of humanity's vulnerability. The question that haunts me, as we stand here in this imagined pre-divine world, is what these early humans thought about existence before anyone told them there were gods to worship. Did they look at the stars and feel wonder but no obligation? Did they experience the sacred without the scaffolding of organized religion, without priests and temples and elaborate rituals? There's something almost enviable about it, this empty epoch. A time when the divine wasn't yet demanding things from humanity, when existence could just be existence without the complicated baggage of cosmic hierarchy and divine law and the thousand tiny rules about which animals you can eat and which days you can work and precisely how to address a deity without accidentally offending them. Of course, I'm romanticizing. Life was probably short, brutal, filled with disease and predation and the constant anxiety of wondering whether you'd find enough food to survive the winter. But still, there's a freedom in not knowing you're supposed to be serving anyone, in thinking the universe owes you nothing and you owe it nothing in return. The pottery shards, scattered around your feet in this imagined temple courtyard, tell stories of the transition if you know how to read them. Early pottery is purely functional. Vessels for storing grain, for carrying water, simple and unadorned because who has time for decoration when you're just trying to survive? But gradually, decoration appears, patterns emerge, symbols develop. And this is where it gets interesting, because symbols imply meaning, and meaning implies complex abstract thought, and complex abstract thought is the foundation of everything that makes us recognizably human. Some of the earliest recurring symbols in Mesopotamian pottery include crosses, circles, zigzag lines that might represent water or mountains, or just zigzag lines, because humans like geometric patterns. The debate rages about whether these early symbols have religious significance or are purely decorative. Are the cross patterns proto-religious symbols anticipating later cosmic symbolism? Or are they just what happens when you drag your fingernail through wet clay and think, hey, that looks neat? We want ancient people to be profound, to imbue everything with deep meaning because it makes them seem more like us, more worthy of study. But maybe sometimes they were just making pots and decorating them without overthinking it. Here's a joke for you, though calling it a joke might be generous. What did the Sumerians say when someone asked what existed before the gods arrived? Nothing, because Sumerian as a language didn't exist yet, and also because the question would have made no sense in their cosmological framework, and also because this is less of a joke and more of a philosophical observation that I'm trying to pass off as humor to meet my 8 light jokes per 1,000 words quota. You're welcome. Actually, speaking of language, one of the genuine mysteries of this empty epoch is when exactly spoken language developed to the point where abstract theological concepts could be communicated. We know complex language must predate writing by tens of thousands of years. You don't suddenly develop the neurological capacity for grammar and syntax right when you invent cuneiform. But at what point did humans sit around fires telling each other stories about why the sky exists and where people go when they die? At what point did someone look at a particularly impressive storm and think, there must be someone making this happen? The transition from natural phenomena to divine explanation is one of the most important cognitive leaps in human history, and it happened entirely during this empty epoch we're exploring, leaving no direct evidence beyond the fact that when writing does finally appear, people are already writing about gods as if everyone already knows exactly who they're talking about. The temperature drops as evening settles over ancient Mesopotamia. Without light pollution, the stars emerge with a clarity modern humans rarely experience, a celestial display so overwhelming it's no wonder ancient peoples saw divinity written in the constellations. The Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light, which is probably why so many early cultures associated it with water and cosmic oceans, and the pathways gods travel between realms. You can almost understand, standing here in this imagined darkness, how the concept of beings descending from that star-scattered expanse could develop. If you'd never heard of physics or astronomy or the cosmological principle, if the sky was genuinely mysterious rather than merely underexplored, wouldn't you look at that display and think, something lives up there, something vast and powerful and interested in what happens down here? The empty epoch represents humanity in potentia, not yet fully realized, not yet bearing the weight of civilization and all its discontents, but containing within itself all the possibilities that will eventually unfold. The genes for language are there, waiting to express themselves fully. The cognitive capacity for abstract thought is there, being exercised in small ways every day as early humans solve problems and plan hunts and remember where the good fruit trees grow. The social structures that will eventually elaborate into kingdoms and empires are there in miniature, in the way groups organize themselves around successful hunters or wise elders or particularly charismatic individuals. Everything that will make the Sumerian civilization possible is already present in these pre-divine people, developing at its own pace, needing no intervention, or, if you believe the fringe theories, needing only a catalyst to accelerate processes that would have occurred eventually anyway, just much more slowly, and perhaps never quite reaching the spectacular heights that written history will record. One of the genuine archaeological puzzles that keeps specialists up at night involves the sudden appearance of large-scale irrigation agriculture in southern Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. The mainstream explanation points to gradual development of hydraulic knowledge, the accumulation of practical experience with water management, the natural progression from small-scale gardening to field-scale farming as populations grew and needed more reliable food sources. But the fringe interpretations, and I'm including some respectable alternative archaeological theories here, not just the ancient aliens enthusiasts, note that irrigation agriculture requires sophisticated understanding of engineering, surveying, mathematics, social organization, and long-term planning. You need to dig canals that maintain proper gradients over miles of landscape. You need to build regulatory structures that control water flow. You need to organize labor forces of hundreds of people working in coordination. You need to develop systems of measurement and calculation, and all of this appears in the archaeological record rather suddenly, without the thousands of years of trial and error we'd expect from people figuring it out from scratch. It's as if someone flipped a switch and suddenly everyone knew how to do large-scale hydraulic engineering, which could be explained by knowledge transmission from earlier cultures, or by a particularly brilliant individual or group making breakthrough discoveries, or, if you're willing to entertain it, by someone teaching them. The sensory details of this pre-divine world must have been so different from what came later. No incense burning in temples because there are no temples, no bell tones ringing out to mark prayer times because there's no organized religion requiring synchronized worship. No crowds gathering for festivals because there are no festivals beyond perhaps seasonal celebrations of successful hunts or good harvests, the kind of informal community gatherings that need no priesthood to organize. The soundscape would be entirely natural, wind through reeds, water flowing, animal calls, human voices speaking Proto-Sumerian or perhaps some earlier language that would be lost entirely once writing preserved only its successor. The smell of cooking fires, of river mud, of wild plants, of human existence at its most basic. No monumental architecture to impose human will on the landscape. Just small settlements that could be abandoned and reclaimed by nature within a generation if their inhabitants decided to move elsewhere. I keep returning to this question of what changed, what transformed these modest Neolithic settlements into the foundation of civilization. The scholarly debate centers on materialist versus diffusionist explanations. Did complex society develop independently in Mesopotamia through internal processes, or was there significant influence from outside, whether from other human cultures or, in the most extreme interpretations, from non-human intelligences? The mainstream archaeological consensus firmly supports the materialist interpretation. Given enough time, similar environmental conditions, and similar selective pressures, human societies will develop similar solutions to similar problems. Writing, monumental architecture, complex religious systems, hierarchical social structures, these emerge independently in multiple locations around the world because they're effective adaptive strategies for large-scale societies. There's no need to invoke external intervention to explain what humans are perfectly capable of developing on their own. But the persistence of the descent from heaven narrative across Sumerian literature shouldn't be dismissed too quickly either. When multiple texts from multiple periods consistently describe the same basic story, gods coming from the sky, establishing civilization, teaching humanity, we have to at least consider what kernel of historical experience might underlie the mythology. Maybe it's folk memory of actual cultural contact with more advanced civilizations now lost to history, whose superior knowledge would have seemed godlike to Neolithic peoples. Maybe it's a metaphorical way of describing the development of abstract thought and self-awareness, the descent of consciousness into matter. Maybe it's exactly what it says it is, and we've become so committed to materialist explanations that we can't recognize historical accounts that don't fit our assumptions about how reality works. Or maybe it's just mythology, stories people tell to make sense of their world, no more literally true than any other creation myth from any other culture. The empty epoch ends not with a whisper but with a bang, or at least that's how the King list describes it, as a sudden descent rather than a gradual emergence. One day there are just humans doing human things, and the next day, or over a period of time compressed in cultural memory until it seems sudden, there are gods walking among them, building cities, establishing order, transforming everything. The transition must have been bewildering if it happened anywhere close to how the texts describe it. Imagine being a person in a small reed hut village, living the same life your ancestors lived for generations, and suddenly there are beings with incomprehensible knowledge building structures that dwarf anything you've ever seen, speaking with authority about cosmic order and divine law and the proper way to organize society. Would you have recognized it as the end of an epoch? Or would it have felt like the beginning of everything that mattered, with everything before it fading into insignificance, into emptiness, into the forgettable prehistory that no one bothers to record? As we prepare to transition into the next section of our journey tonight, take a moment to appreciate the strangeness of this empty epoch, this time before gods, this period of human existence that the Sumerians themselves found so unremarkable they barely documented it. We have to reconstruct it from archaeological fragments, from pottery shards and post holes and trash middens, from the negative space around what they did choose to record. It's history by omission, meaning by absence, story told through silence. And maybe that's appropriate for a time that, according to the people who came after it, was defined primarily by what it lacked: divine presence, cosmic purpose, the meaning that comes from knowing you're part of a larger narrative written by beings greater than yourself. The empty epoch reminds us that there was a time before any of the stories we tell ourselves about reality, a time when existence was just existence, unnarrated and uncommented upon, happening without anyone watching or recording or trying to extract meaning from it. And soon, very soon in our journey tonight, that epoch will end as the Anunnaki make their descent from wherever they come from, and everything changes. The descent begins on a day that feels like any other day, which is somehow more unsettling than if it had announced itself with cosmic fanfare and celestial disturbances. The sun rises over the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia exactly as it has risen for millennia, indifferent to the fact that today will later be remembered as the pivotal moment when everything changed. A woman gathers reeds by the water's edge, her hands moving through routines practiced since childhood. A child throws stones into the river, watching the ripples spread and dissipate. An elder sits outside his reed house, working a piece of flint into a blade, not knowing that within his lifetime, metal tools will make his careful flint knapping obsolete. The ordinary moments of ordinary lives, unremarkable except for what comes next, the way the last normal day before any catastrophe is only recognizable in retrospect. According to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that preserves earlier Sumerian traditions, the first of the Anunnaki to descend is Anu, whose name means simply sky or heaven, the most fundamental attribution you could give to a deity whose primary characteristic is coming from above. Anu represents the cosmic authority of the heavens themselves, not so much a personality as a principle. The idea that order originates from celestial realms and must be imposed on the chaotic earthly sphere. The texts describe Anu's arrival in frustratingly non-specific terms. He came down, or descended, or made his habitation on earth, phrases that tell us the fact of arrival without the method. Did he literally fall from the sky? Did he walk out of the river, emerging from the cosmic waters that connected all realms in Sumerian cosmology? Did he simply appear one day in the temple at Eridu, manifesting from nothing? The texts assume you already know and don't need these details explained, which is maddening for anyone trying to reconstruct what actually happened versus what became mythology. The mainstream historical fact we can anchor to is that the Anu-Enki relationship dominates early Sumerian religious thought. Anu, the father of the gods, delegates authority over earthly matters to his son Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who becomes the active agent of civilization building, while Anu remains in the heavens as the distant supreme authority. This pattern, a remote sky father and an engaged intermediary, appears in many religious traditions and tells us something about how early humans conceptualized power structures, projecting earthly patterns of kingship onto cosmic scales. Kings had viziers who did the actual work of governance, so gods must too. The theological framework reflects the political reality, or perhaps the political reality was designed to mirror the theological framework. The usual chicken and egg problem of distinguishing whether religion shapes society or society shapes religion. Here's where the quirky interpretation makes things interesting. Some researchers focusing on the linguistic analysis of Sumerian god names suggest that Anunnaki might be less a proper name for a specific group of deities and more a descriptive title meaning something like princely offspring or those of royal blood who came down. The compound breaks down into Anu, heaven sky, Na, of from, and Ki, earth, literally translating to something like those who from heaven to earth came. If this interpretation is correct, and plenty of Sumerian language specialists dispute the exact parsing, then Anunnaki isn't identifying who these beings are, but where they came from and what they did, the ancient equivalent of calling someone the guy who moved here from out of town. This would suggest that the Sumerians understood these beings as foreign, as other, as fundamentally different from the indigenous human population in ways that went beyond mere power differential. The scholarly debate around this centers on whether the Sumerians intended literal or metaphorical interpretation of the descent narratives. The literalist camp, not just fringe theorists, but some mainstream historians who take texts at face value when cultural context supports it, argues that ancient people generally meant what they said and didn't have the modern luxury of clearly distinguishing between literal and figurative language. When Sumerian texts say the Anunnaki descended from heaven, perhaps they're reporting what they believed happened, even if we now interpret that heaven differently than they did. The metaphorical camp counters that sophisticated ancient civilizations were perfectly capable of symbolic thinking and poetic language, that taking myths literally misunderstands their function as meaning-making narratives rather than historical records. Both camps accuse the other of projecting modern assumptions onto ancient texts. The literalists projecting materialist concerns about factual accuracy, the metaphoricalists projecting postmodern sophistication about the nature of narrative. The descent, as recorded in the earliest strata of Sumerian literature, involves 7 primary Anunnaki establishing themselves in 7 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, Uruk, and Kish. Each deity claims a city as their cult center, their earthly power base, the location where humans will build temples and offer sacrifices and seek divine favor. Enki gets Eridu, the first and most ancient city. Enlil, god of wind and storm, establishes himself at Nippur, which becomes the religious capital of Sumer even when political power shifts elsewhere. Inanna takes Uruk, which will become famous in later literature as the city of Gilgamesh. The pattern suggests coordination, a planned colonization rather than random arrival, each deity selecting territory according to some cosmic organizational principle that made sense to them but whose logic we can only guess at from fragmentary texts. The moment of first contact between gods and humans must have been extraordinary, assuming anything remotely like this actually occurred beyond the realm of pure mythology. Try to imagine being an early human encountering a being who demonstrates knowledge and abilities far exceeding anything in your experience. The technological gap between Neolithic humanity and whatever the Anunnaki represented, whether advanced humans from elsewhere, metaphorical personifications of abstract concepts, literal divine entities, or something else entirely, would have been so vast that any sufficiently advanced technology would indeed be indistinguishable from magic. To paraphrase Arthur C. Clarke's famous observation, a being who knew astronomy, mathematics, engineering, medicine, agriculture beyond the simple plant a seed, hope it grows level, such a being would seem godlike by definition, because God is simply the category humans create for entities operating on incomprehensibly higher levels than ourselves. The sensory experience of the descent, if we try to reconstruct it from textual hints and archaeological inference, involves sudden construction on unprecedented scales. Imagine living in a village of simple reed houses, the tallest structure being maybe 10 feet high, and suddenly watching the foundations being laid for a temple that will rise 50, 60, 70 feet into the air. The noise would be overwhelming. Hundreds of workers digging, hauling, brick making, voices shouting instructions in multiple languages or dialects as people from different settlements are organized into labor forces. The smell of fresh mud bricks drying by the thousands, the sweat of collective effort, the smoke from fires burning constantly to bake ceramics and prepare food for the work crews. The visual transformation as the landscape changes from natural to built, from organic curves of reed beds and river channels to geometric precision of planned architecture aligned to cardinal directions and celestial events. Enki's first act upon establishing himself in Eridu, according to several surviving texts, is the establishment of the me, a concept so fundamental to Sumerian civilization that we don't have a good English translation for it. The me are sometimes described as divine decrees, sometimes as the fundamental properties of civilization, sometimes as actual objects that can be stolen or transferred or lost. They encompass everything from kingship and priesthood to warfare and music to sexual intercourse and prostitution, basically the entire package of cultural knowledge and social institutions that distinguish civilization from non-civilization. Enki possesses the me and distributes them to appropriate deities and eventually to humans, like a cosmic library of civilization-building blueprints. The mainstream interpretation treats the me as an abstract concept that Sumerian theology used to explain why their society was organized the way it was, a kind of divine justification for existing social structures. The fringe interpretation whispers about actual knowledge repositories, written instructions or genetic modifications, or technological gifts that enabled rapid cultural development. Here's a delightful scholarly argument that's been ongoing since at least the 1930s. Did Sumerian civilization develop in isolation, or was it influenced by an earlier, now lost civilization? The isolationist theory, supported by most mainstream archaeologists, holds that Sumerians developed their civilization independently through normal cultural evolution processes, building on Neolithic foundations that we can trace in the archaeological record through continuous pottery sequences and settlement patterns. The diffusionist theory, which ranges from respectable alternative archaeology to wild speculation depending on who's proposing it, suggests that Sumerian civilization shows signs of sudden advancement that make more sense if significant knowledge was imported from elsewhere. The evidence cited by diffusionists includes the fully formed nature of early Sumerian writing. Cuneiform appears around 3200 BCE, already capable of expressing complex administrative and religious concepts, as if the hard work of developing writing had already been done somewhere else and was being imported wholesale rather than invented from scratch. The Anunnaki establish what the texts call the Duku, described variously as a sacred mountain, a holy mound, or the first temple, depending on which translation you're reading and which scholarly interpretation you're following. The Duku serves as the connection point between heaven and earth, the axis mundi where different cosmic realms intersect, the place where gods and humans can interact without either violating their essential nature. This concept of sacred architecture as literally connecting earth to heaven becomes foundational to Mesopotamian religion. Ziggurats are later built specifically as artificial mountains, allowing gods to descend and humans to ascend, creating the interface that makes divine-human interaction possible. The mainstream interpretation sees this as purely symbolic, religious architecture designed to facilitate spiritual practices and reinforce theological concepts. The alternative interpretation that makes archaeologists uncomfortable suggests that perhaps something functional was being described, that the connection to heaven might reference actual communication technology or transportation methods that got mythologized over time into religious symbolism. The daily rhythm of life transforms with the Anunnaki's descent. Before their arrival, time flows in natural cycles, day and night, seasons, the rhythms of weather and animal migration and plant growth. After their arrival, time becomes structured differently, organized around sacred calendars and ritual schedules and the demanding routines of temple service and agricultural obligation. The Sumerian calendar is lunar, tracking the moon through its phases, but adjusted periodically to keep agricultural seasons aligned with the solar year through intercalary months added as needed. This is sophisticated timekeeping, requiring careful observation and mathematical calculation and coordinated social agreement about when exactly a month begins and how to handle the fact that 12 lunar cycles don't quite match the solar year. Did the Anunnaki teach this to humans, or did humans develop it independently to meet the needs of agricultural civilization? The texts credit the gods with establishing the calendar, which could mean they literally taught it, or could mean they were given credit for whatever humans figured out on their own, because attributing all good things to gods is standard ancient practice. Food changes. Before the descent, diet is varied but unreliable. Whatever can be hunted, gathered, or grown in small gardens, subject to the vagaries of weather and chance. After the descent, agriculture intensifies and diversifies. Barley becomes the staple grain, grown in irrigated fields that produce reliable surpluses. Date palms are cultivated systematically, providing sweet fruit and syrup. Sheep and goats are domesticated more extensively, providing meat, milk, wool, leather. The development of beer brewing, barley fermented with date syrup, creates a safe source of calories and hydration that can be stored and transported, solving the problem that river water is often contaminated and milk spoils quickly in hot climates. The standardization of bread and beer production isn't just a culinary development, but a social one, requiring specialized knowledge, dedicated labor, storage facilities, and distribution systems. These are the foundation of everything else. You can't build monumental architecture or support a priest class or wage war if your population is still scrambling daily just to find enough calories to survive. The joke writes itself here. What did the Anunnaki and gluten-free dieters have in common? They both thought carbs would change humanity forever, though only one of them was right about which direction that change would go. Actually, speaking of bread and beer, there's a genuine scholarly debate about which came first. Did humans develop agriculture to make bread or to make beer? The bread first theory seems intuitive. Obviously, people need food before recreational fermentation. But the beer first theory points out that fermented grains would have appeared accidentally in stored grain that got wet, and the resulting psychoactive effects might have provided strong motivation to figure out how to replicate the process intentionally, with bread being a secondary development once grain cultivation was already established for brewing purposes. This is the kind of question that academics can spend entire careers researching, tracking starch residues on ancient pottery and analyzing grain remains from archaeological sites and running chemical analyses to determine what early fermentation processes might have looked like. The Anunnaki probably didn't care whether bread or beer came first. They just wanted humans to have reliable nutrition so they could perform whatever function the gods had in mind for them. The descent brings language revolution along with everything else. Sumerian emerges as a fully formed written language around 3200 BCE, appearing first as pictographs that gradually become stylized into the wedge-shaped cuneiform characters that will dominate Mesopotamian writing for 3,000 years. The mainstream fact is that early Sumerian writing was used primarily for economic administration, tracking temple inventory, recording tax payments, documenting business transactions. The earliest tablets are boring ledgers listing quantities of grain and numbers of sheep, the kind of content that makes accountants' hearts sing and everyone else's eyes glaze over. But this practical origin actually makes perfect sense. Writing was invented not to record literature or history or religious thought, but to solve the logistical problems of managing increasingly complex economic systems. The temples accumulated wealth, coordinated labor, controlled distribution of resources, and desperately needed some way to track all this besides human memory, which is notoriously unreliable when dealing with whether someone paid their barley tax 3 years ago. The quirky interpretation that circulates in alternative history circles points to the oddity that Sumerian, unlike every other language in the region, is a linguistic isolate. It's not related to any other known language family. Akkadian, which eventually replaces Sumerian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia, is Semitic and fits nicely into the linguistic family tree with Arabic and Hebrew, but Sumerian, it's alone, unique, unrelated to anything before or after it, as if it appeared from nowhere and disappeared into academic study without leaving linguistic descendants. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Sumerian must have been related to other languages, but either those languages left no records or they died out before any contact with literate civilizations, leaving Sumerian as the sole survivor of its language family. The fringe explanation suggests that Sumerian's isolation might indicate it was introduced rather than developed, brought by a population that arrived from elsewhere. Whether that elsewhere is a different region of the ancient world, or, in the most extreme interpretations, somewhere not on Earth at all. The Anunnaki establish what Sumerian texts call the black-headed people, a phrase that appears repeatedly to describe humans under divine rule, possibly referring to hair color or perhaps being a conventional literary term whose literal meaning isn't the point. These people are organized into city-states, each politically independent but culturally connected, sharing language and writing and religious practices while competing economically and militarily. The city-state model that emerges in Sumer becomes influential across human history. Ancient Greece will later adopt essentially the same system, and the fundamental tension between local autonomy and larger unity continues to shape political thought even today. Was this political structure taught by the Anunnaki, or did it develop organically from the geography of southern Mesopotamia, where cities naturally formed around river access points but were separated by marshlands that made unified political control difficult? The texts credit the gods with establishing kingship as an institution, with specific kings receiving direct divine mandate to rule, but the archaeological evidence suggests political development might have been messier and more gradual than the religious narratives acknowledge. The technological leap associated with the descent is genuinely remarkable, even if we strip away all mythological interpretation. Between 4000 and 3000 BCE, southern Mesopotamia goes from Neolithic villages to urban civilization with writing, monumental architecture, complex administration, specialized craft production, long-distance trade networks, and sophisticated hydraulic engineering. That's an extraordinary transformation in just a millennium, though describing it as just a millennium reveals how warped our sense of time becomes when discussing prehistory. 1,000 years is 40 generations, enough time for cumulative cultural development to compound into something that seems sudden when compressed into a paragraph. The isolationist interpretation says this pace of change, while rapid, is within the bounds of normal human cultural evolution when populations reach certain density thresholds and environmental conditions favor agricultural intensification. The diffusionist interpretation says the rate of change suggests knowledge transfer from an outside source, whether that source is other human populations or something more exotic. The temple complexes that rise during and after the descent become the organizing centers of Sumerian life, combining religious, economic, political, and educational functions in single institutions. The Temple of Enki at Eridu, through its 18 reconstruction phases, grows from a small shrine to a massive complex occupying acres, employing hundreds of priests and support staff, controlling vast agricultural estates, and accumulating wealth that rivals or exceeds that of secular rulers. The mainstream historical fact is that temples functioned as redistributive economic centers. Farmers brought their surpluses to the temple stored and managed these resources, and then redistributed them to support non-agricultural specialists like craftspeople, administrators, soldiers, and priests themselves. This system allowed economic specialization that wouldn't be possible if everyone had to produce their own food. The temple guaranteed a form of social insurance. If your crop failed, the temple's stored reserves kept you alive. In exchange, the temple demanded labor, loyalty, and religious devotion. The alternative interpretation that theologians and archaeologists argue about endlessly is whether Sumerian temples were primarily religious institutions that happened to have economic functions, or primarily economic institutions that used religious ideology to justify their power. Were priests genuinely mediating between gods and humans, or were they clever managers who recognized that divine authority provided better social control than mere economic coercion? The answer is probably both, which is the frustrating truth about most historical either-or questions. Ancient people were perfectly capable of genuine religious belief while simultaneously manipulating religious institutions for practical benefit. The Anunnaki in this model function as the ultimate validation of priestly authority. I'm not telling you to give the temple your grain because I want to control resources. I'm telling you because the gods demand it, and I'm just the messenger. Take it up with Enki if you have problems. The descent narrative includes an element that mainstream historians largely ignore but that fascinates alternative researchers. The texts describe the Anunnaki as physically distinct from humans, taller, longer-lived, more powerful. These descriptions could be purely mythological. Gods in every culture are described as superior to humans in every way because that's what makes them gods. But some researchers point to Sumerian art, depicting kings and gods as notably taller than common people, and suggest this might preserve visual memory of actual physical differences between ruling and ruled populations. The mainstream explanation is that hierarchical art conventions make important figures bigger to denote their social status, not their actual height. Egyptian pharaohs are shown larger than their subjects in tomb paintings, even though they weren't actually giants. But the persistent detail across multiple texts that the Anunnaki lived for enormous spans of time, the antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list, have reigns lasting thousands or tens of thousands of years, at least raises the question of what historical reality, if any, is being recorded in exaggerated form. Social stratification crystallizes during the descent period, transforming relatively egalitarian Neolithic communities into sharply hierarchical societies. At the top sit the gods, remote and powerful. Just below them, the Lugal or big man, the king who rules as divine representative. Then priests, administrators, military commanders, wealthy merchants. Below them, craftspeople, farmers, laborers. At the bottom, slaves captured in war or born into servitude. This hierarchy becomes encoded in law, in religious practice, in art and architecture, and the physical layout of cities themselves. The temple district occupies the highest ground, literally and figuratively elevated above common residential areas. The poor live in the lowest, most flood-prone areas. The city becomes a physical map of social power, with everyone knowing their place in the cosmic order that the Anunnaki established. Was this hierarchy imposed by the gods, or did humans create it and then attribute divine sanction to naturalize and perpetuate what might otherwise seem like arbitrary inequality? Again, probably both. The genius of effective power structures is that they convince people they're inevitable, natural, ordained by forces beyond human control, which makes resistance seem not just dangerous, but literally blasphemous. As evening settles over the Mesopotamian landscape in this imaginative reconstruction, we can appreciate the magnitude of transformation the descent narratives describe. A world that was empty of gods becomes full of them. A landscape of scattered villages becomes a network of cities. Oral culture becomes literate. Egalitarian bands become stratified civilizations. And through it all, the Anunnaki stand at the center, credited by Sumerian sources as the agents of change, the teachers of civilization, the beings who transformed humanity from simple food producers into something capable of abstract thought, monumental creation, and cosmic self-reflection. Whether we interpret this literally or metaphorically, historically or mythologically, the descent represents one of the most important transition points in human cultural development, the moment, real or imagined, when everything changed. And we're only beginning our journey through what comes next, as these gods who descended from heaven begin the complicated, often troubling project of building a civilization and deciding what role humanity will play in it. The first structure is never quite right, which is oddly reassuring in its human imperfection. The earliest temple at Eridu, dated through pottery analysis and carbon dating to around 5000 BCE, measures barely 10 by 10 feet, a modest mud brick room with a single entrance and what appears to be an altar platform along one wall. This is the Temple, the prototype, the original blueprint from which all subsequent Mesopotamian religious architecture will elaborate and extrapolate. But it's small, almost disappointingly so, more like a storage shed than the house of a god, and within a generation or two it's been torn down and replaced with something slightly larger, slightly more sophisticated, beginning a cycle of destruction and rebuilding that will continue for thousands of years, each new temple built directly atop its predecessor, creating an artificial hill that archaeologists call a tell, the accumulated debris of human devotion raising the sacred site incrementally closer to the heavens it's meant to connect with. The mainstream historical fact that grounds our exploration of temple architecture is that Mesopotamian ziggurats, the stepped pyramidal structures that become iconic of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian civilization, developed directly from this tradition of sequential rebuilding. Each reconstruction phase at sites like Eridu shows incremental innovations. Walls become thicker, ceilings higher, decorative elements more elaborate. Buttresses appear on exterior walls, providing both structural support and visual rhythm. Interior spaces become more complex, adding side chambers for storage, living quarters for priests, reception rooms for ritual activities. The altar platform grows into a distinct architectural feature elevated above the main floor, accessed by steps, becoming the focal point where divine and human realms intersect. By the Uruk period, around 3500 BCE, temple complexes sprawl across acres, employing hundreds, controlling vast estates, and dominating the urban landscape both physically and socially. The earliest temples were barely visible bumps on flat terrain. Later ones tower as the tallest structures for miles, impossible to ignore, asserting divine presence through sheer architectural ambition. The quirky interpretation that makes archaeological conferences interesting involves questions about who actually designed these structures. The texts credit the Anunnaki themselves with providing architectural knowledge. Enki is specifically called the Lord of Builders, and various myths describe gods drawing up plans and supervising construction. Mainstream scholars interpret this as standard ancient practice of attributing human achievements to divine inspiration, the same way Renaissance painters claimed angels guided their hands, or how modern artists thank their muse. But some researchers ask a genuinely interesting question: where did the architectural knowledge come from? Building a structure that won't collapse requires understanding principles of load-bearing, material strength, foundation stability, principles that humans presumably figured out through trial and error involving lots of collapsed buildings and crushed workers. Yet the archaeological record at Eridu shows sophisticated architecture appearing relatively early, with fewer obvious failures than we'd expect from a purely experimental development process. Either the trial and error happened elsewhere and successful techniques were imported, or there was some form of knowledge transfer that accelerated the learning curve, which could be explained through entirely human mechanisms like master-apprentice training, but which texts insist involved divine instruction. The scholarly debate that generates the most heated arguments at academic conferences centers on function versus symbolism in temple architecture. The functionalist camp argues that temples, despite their religious purpose, were fundamentally practical buildings designed to meet concrete needs: storage of agricultural surpluses, housing for priestly staff, spaces for administrative activities, workshops for craft production. The religious symbolism was secondary, decoration layered onto functional architecture. The symbolist camp counters that temples were primarily symbolic structures, that their design encoded theological concepts and cosmological principles, that every architectural element from door placement to room dimensions carried meaning that practitioners would have understood. The functionalists accuse the symbolists of overinterpreting, of seeing deep meaning in pragmatic choices. Of course, the main door faces east. That's where the sun rises, providing natural light for morning activities. The symbolists accuse the functionalists of missing the obvious, of reducing complex religious practice to mere logistics. Of course, the main door faces east. It's aligned with celestial phenomena central to Sumerian religious thought. Both camps are probably right, which means both camps are also probably wrong, because ancient architects were capable of making choices that were simultaneously practical and symbolic, that solved functional problems while encoding theological meaning. The sensory experience of temple construction must have been overwhelming for early Mesopotamians. Imagine the noise, thousands of workers digging clay, mixing mud with straw, forming bricks, stacking them to dry, the constant rhythmic sound of human labor coordinated on unprecedented scales. The visual transformation as structures rise above the single-story height that defines domestic architecture, climbing 10 feet, 20, eventually 40 and 50 feet into the air, creating artificial mountains visible for miles across flat marshlands. The smell of fresh mud bricks, distinctive and earthy, mixed with bitumen used as mortar and waterproofing, its petroleum tang cutting through the organic sense of agricultural life. The heat radiating from walls drying in Mesopotamian sun, intense enough that workers probably performed most labor during early morning and evening hours, avoiding midday heat that would make physical exertion dangerous. The crowds gathering to watch construction in progress, because monumental building projects would have been rare enough to function as public entertainment, the ancient equivalent of watching skyscrapers rise in modern cities. The White Temple at Uruk, constructed around 3200 BCE, represents the culmination of centuries of architectural development, though calling anything culmination in a tradition that continues for millennia is historically naive. The structure measures roughly 60 by 80 feet, sits atop a 40-foot-high platform, features whitewashed exterior walls that give it its modern name, and incorporates sophisticated design elements like a central hall with smaller rooms arranged around it, multiple entrance points, evidence of a courtyard for gathering, and interior walls decorated with colored mosaics, small clay cones with painted tips pressed into wet plaster to create geometric patterns. This is undeniably sophisticated architecture, requiring not just labor but planning, mathematical calculation, resource management, and aesthetic vision. The mainstream interpretation sees the White Temple as evidence of natural cultural evolution, societies getting better at building over time through accumulated knowledge. The alternative interpretation asks where the mathematical knowledge came from to ensure structural stability, why architectural sophistication appears relatively early in the sequence rather than after centuries of trial and error, and whether the texts claiming divine architectural instruction might contain some kernel of historical truth about knowledge transfer from an outside source. The ziggurat form that becomes iconic of Mesopotamian civilization functions literally as a stairway between realms. The Sumerian term for these structures, unir, means mountain house, and texts explicitly describe them as allowing gods to descend from heaven to earth and, theoretically at least humans, to ascend partway toward divine realms. The most famous example is the Etemenanke ziggurat in Babylon, dedicated to Marduk, which probably inspired the biblical Tower of Babel story, a structure so impressive that Hebrew writers incorporated it into their own mythology as an example of human hubris punished by God. But Etemenanke was built around 1600 BCE, much later than the earlier ziggurats at Uruk, and Eridu. The principle is consistent across millennia. Create an artificial mountain, top it with a temple, establish a ritual path of ascent, and you've built the cosmic axis where different levels of reality intersect. Here's a question that keeps me up at night. What did the Anunnaki actually do in these temples? If we take the texts at something resembling face value, gods physically resided in temples, ate food offerings, engaged with priests, issued instructions, performed miracles, and generally behaved like royalty holding court. But what does that mean practically? The mainstream interpretation is that these are entirely human projections, priests performing rituals they believed the gods appreciated, interpreting signs and omens as divine communication, eating the food offerings themselves while maintaining the fiction that gods consume them spiritually. No one actually expected gods to physically manifest and have conversations. The religious practice was symbolic, meaningful to participants, but not involving literal divine presence. The alternative interpretation, which ranges from respectable theological argument to wild speculation, suggests that something actually happened in these temples, that priests experienced what they interpreted as genuine divine encounter, whether that encounter was psychological, mystical, hallucinogenic, or involved some form of actual entity. The texts describe these encounters as physical, not metaphorical, gods speaking, appearing, performing actions in the material world. If we dismiss this entirely as fiction, we're imposing modern materialist assumptions onto ancient people who might have been reporting genuine experiences in the only language available to them. The construction techniques for monumental architecture involve innovations that scholars can't quite agree were revolutionary or evolutionary. Mud bricks, the fundamental building material, are simple in concept. Mix clay with straw or sand for binding, form into rectangular blocks, dry in sun. But optimal mud brick production requires understanding the correct ratios of ingredients, proper drying time, best clay sources, how to achieve uniform size for structural stability. Bitumen, used as waterproofing and mortar, had to be sourced from natural seeps, transported, prepared, and applied with knowledge of its properties and limitations. Stone, relatively rare in southern Mesopotamia, was imported from considerable distances for foundation elements and key structural features, requiring not just transportation logistics but knowledge of different stone types and their properties. Metal tools, copper and later bronze, enabled more precise work than possible with stone tools, but metallurgy itself requires specialized knowledge of ore processing, smelting, alloying, and forging. Each of these technical innovations appears in the archaeological record with less preceding development than we'd expect if each was figured out from scratch through trial and error, which could mean the development happened elsewhere and was imported, or could mean we're missing earlier sites that haven't been excavated, or could mean knowledge developed faster than we'd expect because humans are clever and capable of leaps of insight. The joke practically writes itself. What did Sumerian architects and modern engineers have in common? They both realized the foundation is the most important part, though only one of them could blame structural failures on angering the gods. Actually, speaking of foundations, there's a fascinating debate about the mathematical knowledge required for large-scale architecture. Building structures that don't collapse requires understanding ratios, proportions, load calculations, geometric principles. Some researchers analyzing Sumerian architecture argue that building dimensions and proportions reveal understanding of sophisticated mathematical relationships, possibly including the golden ratio that shouldn't exist if mathematical knowledge was purely practical and empirically derived. The mainstream response is that builders developed rules of thumb through experience. This proportion of base to height tends to work. This relationship between wall thickness and ceiling span prevents collapse, without necessarily understanding the underlying mathematical principles. The alternative interpretation suggests that mathematical knowledge preceded practical application, that someone taught the mathematics and then showed how to apply it, rather than mathematics being abstracted from successful building practices. The temple economy transforms Mesopotamian society as profoundly as temple architecture transforms the landscape. Temples function as massive economic engines, accumulating wealth through tithes, offerings, and control of agricultural land, then redistributing resources to support non-agricultural populations. The Inanna precinct at Uruk, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, controlled estates producing barley, dates, and other crops, employed hundreds of laborers, craftspeople, administrators, and priests, engaged in long-distance trade, and accumulated wealth that rivaled the holdings of secular rulers. Tablets from temple archives record mind-numbing detail about economic transactions, delivery receipts for grain, ration distributions for workers, breeding records for livestock, textile production quotas, trade expeditions to distant regions. This is the unsexy foundation of civilization, accounting. You can't have monumental architecture without economic surplus. You can't have economic surplus without agricultural productivity. You can't have agricultural productivity without irrigation. You can't have irrigation without social organization. And you can't have social organization without someone keeping track of who owns what and who owes whom, which means writing, which means literacy, which means specialized scribal training, which means schools attached to temples because temples are the only institutions wealthy enough to support the luxury of educating people in skills that don't immediately produce food. The emergence of writing alongside temple construction isn't coincidental, it's causally connected. The earliest writing, appearing around 3200 BCE, consists almost entirely of economic records associated with temple administration. Someone needed to track the thousands of transactions occurring daily in a complex, redistributive economy, and human memory, even trained memory, couldn't handle the volume. So writing developed specifically to solve this problem, beginning as simple pictographs representing commodities and numbers, gradually adding phonetic elements that allow recording of names and eventually abstract concepts and finally full linguistic expression. By 2600 BCE, Sumerian scribes are writing epic poetry, hymns, proverbs, myths, legal codes, mathematical problems, astronomical observations, the full range of human thought committed to clay tablets. But it starts with 6 sheep delivered to Temple of Inanna on month 2 day 14. Not poetic, but absolutely foundational to everything that follows. The architectural symbolism encoded in temple design reveals theological concepts that scholars have spent careers decoding. The number 7 appears repeatedly, 7 levels to major ziggurats, 7 gates in the descent to the underworld, 7 primary Anunnaki deities. The number 60, base of the Sumerian numerical system, carries sacred significance and appears in temple dimensions and proportions. Colors carry meaning: white for purity, blue for celestial realms, red for earthly power, black for the underworld. Directional orientation matters: doors facing east toward sunrise, altars facing west toward sunset, processional ways aligned with stellar phenomena. Room dimensions follow mathematical ratios that might represent cosmological concepts. Some researchers argue that temple layouts map celestial relationships, that floor plans diagram the cosmos in architectural form. The mainstream interpretation says we might be overreading meaning into what could be aesthetic choices or practical considerations. The symbolist interpretation says the ancients didn't make arbitrary aesthetic choices, that every element in sacred architecture carried layers of meaning that practitioners understood even if we struggle to decode them millennia later. The interaction between gods and humans, as texts describe it, occurs primarily in these temple complexes. The daily ritual cycle involves waking the god's statue in the morning, washing and dressing it, offering breakfast, conducting midday rituals, providing evening meals, preparing the statue for sleep at night, treating the divine image as if it were a living being with physical needs. Modern observers find this practice primitive, even silly, projecting consciousness onto inanimate objects. But Mesopotamian theology was sophisticated in ways we often miss. They didn't believe the god was literally the statue, but that the statue, when properly consecrated and ritually maintained, could serve as a vehicle for divine presence, a point of intersection where gods could manifest into the material world. It's not different in principle from believing radio waves can be translated into sound by the right equipment. The statue is equipment for translating divine presence into a form humans can perceive and interact with. The temple precincts expand beyond purely religious functions to become the cultural centers of Sumerian cities. Scribal schools train the next generation of administrators in cuneiform writing, mathematics, and literature. Workshops produce textiles, pottery, metalwork, jewelry, carved seals, luxury goods that demonstrate civilizational sophistication. Libraries accumulate tablets recording everything from religious texts to mathematical tables to medical prescriptions to collections of proverbs. Observatories track celestial phenomena, not just for religious purposes, but for practical calendar calculation and, eventually, for the mathematical astronomy that will become one of Mesopotamia's greatest intellectual achievements. The temple is school, library, factory, bank, administrative center, and religious institution simultaneously, which makes sense in a society that doesn't separate sacred from secular the way modern cultures do. There is no secular, Everything operates under divine authority and sanction, which means the temple, as the nexus of divine-human interaction, naturally becomes the center of all civilized activity. The human labor that builds these structures raises ethical questions that ancient texts largely ignore but that modern scholars argue about constantly. How many workers did it take to build the White Temple at Uruk? How were they recruited? Voluntarily, through religious devotion, through obligatory temple service, through forced labor of conquered populations? What were their working conditions? How many died in construction accidents? The temples themselves sit silent on these questions, their inscriptions praising gods and kings but rarely mentioning the thousands of anonymous workers who mixed mud, hauled bricks, dug foundations, and risked their lives on scaffolding stories above ground. Archaeological evidence of workers' villages near major construction sites suggests at least some labor was organized into permanent or semi-permanent workforces, probably a mix of full-time temple employees, seasonal agricultural workers during slow farming periods, and corvée labor obligated to the temple or king. The scale of construction indicates impressive organizational capacity. Someone was coordinating logistics, managing supply chains, scheduling work crews, solving engineering problems, feeding thousands of workers. But the texts credit this organization to divine wisdom rather than human administrative achievement. As twilight settles over these imagined temple complexes, the limestone and mud brick walls still warm from the day's heat, you can almost hear the evening rituals beginning. Priests chanting hymns in Sumerian, the smell of incense drifting from altar fires, the soft shuffle of sandaled feet on stone floors, the low murmur of prayers offered in hope and fear and gratitude. The temples transform from construction sites to living centers of religious practice, from ambitious architectural projects to the beating hearts of civilizations, from piles of mud and bitumen into something recognized as sacred, set apart, worthy of devotion. Whether the Anunnaki actually walked these halls, or whether they existed only in human imagination and religious yearning, might matter less than the fact that believing they did inspired humans to create something magnificent, something that lasted millennia, something that still speaks to us across the vast gap of historical time about what matters enough to build toward heaven. The first conflict between gods isn't recorded in any single text, but has to be reconstructed from scattered references across multiple compositions, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box to guide you. The dispute centers, as so many disputes do, on control, specifically, control over humanity and the question of what humans are actually for in the cosmic scheme the Anunnaki have imposed on Mesopotamia. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, rules from Nippur as the king of gods on earth, having received that authority from his father Anu who remains in the heavens. Enlil views humans primarily as workers, creatures designed and designated to perform the agricultural labor that produces food for divine consumption and to maintain the temples where gods reside. This isn't slavery exactly, at least not in Enlil's view. It's cosmic duty, the purpose for which humans exist, the role they were literally created to fulfill. The texts describe human creation explicitly in these terms. The gods were burdened with labor, the work was heavy, and so they created humans to bear the burden in their place. Not a particularly flattering origin story for humanity, but at least it's honest about the transactional nature of the divine-human relationship. Enki, on the other hand, seems to have a more complicated relationship with humanity. The god of wisdom and fresh water, associated with the Abzu or cosmic underground ocean, Enki is credited in multiple texts as humanity's creator, designer, benefactor, and occasional protector against the harsher intentions of other deities. Where Enlil sees humans as tools, Enki appears to view them as, well, not equals certainly, but perhaps as interesting projects, creatures capable of growth and development, worthy of occasional mercy and instruction. This fundamental disagreement about humanity's nature and purpose becomes the source of conflicts that shape Mesopotamian mythology and, by extension, the religious worldview of the entire ancient Near East. The mainstream historical fact is that this theological tension reflects actual social conflicts within Sumerian civilization, tensions between different cities with different patron deities, between priestly factions supporting different gods, between social classes with different interests. The gods' conflicts metaphorically represent human conflicts, providing divine precedent and justification for earthly political struggles. The quirky interpretation that makes this interesting comes from researchers who take the conflict narratives more literally and ask, what if these represent actual disagreements between actual entities, whatever those entities were? If we accept even the possibility that something real underlies these myths, whether advanced humans from elsewhere, non-human intelligences, or literal gods, then the conflicts described might preserve garbled memory of genuine debates about genetic engineering ethics, about the proper treatment of created species, about the responsibilities creators bear toward their creations. This interpretation requires serious suspension of materialist assumptions, but it does make the texts more internally coherent. The gods argue with remarkable specificity about technical matters. What capabilities should humans possess? How long should they live? Should they be allowed to reproduce indefinitely, or should population be controlled? These read less like abstract theological speculation and more like the kind of practical questions that would actually arise if you were designing a biological workforce from scratch. The scholarly debate divides between reading mythology as purely symbolic versus containing historical kernels. The symbolist camp argues that divine conflicts represent human psychological dynamics, social tensions, or natural phenomena projected onto cosmic scales. Enlil's storms literally destroy human settlements, so of course he's characterized as hostile to humanity, while Enki's fresh water literally enables civilization through irrigation, so of course he's characterized as humanity's benefactor. The historicist camp, a minority position but not without serious scholars, suggests that at least some mythological content preserves actual historical events and conflicts, though translated into religious language. When texts describe the Anunnaki Council debating human policy, perhaps they're describing actual councils of rulers or priests or whoever the Anunnaki actually were, making actual decisions about governance and social organization. Neither interpretation fully satisfies because, as usual, the truth probably involves both, symbolic meaning layered onto historical events, or historical events filtered through symbolic interpretation, until distinguishing between them becomes impossible. The sensory experience of divine conflict, as texts describe it, involves natural disasters that devastate human populations. When Enlil becomes angry at human noise and decides to reduce the population, he sends plague, then famine, then drought, each disaster killing thousands, warning survivors to behave more quietly and respectfully toward divine peace. The smell of disease, of bodies decomposing in Mesopotamian heat because there aren't enough healthy people to maintain burial practices. The sound of mourning, parents keening over children's corpses, communities decimated by invisible death. The sight of withered crops, irrigation canals running dry, livestock dying for lack of fodder, the entire agricultural system collapsing under divine displeasure. The taste of desperation, rationing inadequate food supplies, making impossible choices about who eats and who starves. The physical sensation of weakness from malnutrition, the lethargy of starvation, the gradual shutdown of bodily functions when caloric intake drops below survival minimums. If these disasters were historically real, whether as natural catastrophes interpreted as divine punishment or as deliberately inflicted population controls, they would have been traumatic enough to scar collective memory for generations, creating myths that preserved the emotional truth of survival horror even if specific details became distorted through repeated retellings. The flood narrative represents the ultimate divine conflict and its resolution. The story appears in multiple versions: the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the Assyrian flood tablet incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic, but the basic plot remains consistent. Humanity becomes too numerous and too noisy. Enlil decides to eliminate them through a global flood. Enki warns his favorite human, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim depending on the version, to build a boat and preserve life. The flood destroys humanity except for the boat's passengers. The surviving human offers sacrifice. The gods realize they've made a mistake because now there's no one to provide food and worship, and a compromise is reached where humanity can continue existing but with population controls to prevent the original problem. The mainstream interpretation treats this as pure mythology, perhaps inspired by local flooding events. The Euphrates and Tigris flood regularly, and catastrophic floods would have been remembered and mythologized. The alternative interpretation points to the uncomfortable specificity of the flood narrative, which appears not just in Mesopotamia but in cultures around the world, with details that are remarkably similar considering the alleged independent development of these myths. Here's the controversial question. Did something like the flood actually happen? The mainstream answer is no. Global floods are geologically impossible. There's no evidence of worldwide deluge at any point in human history, and flood myths are universal because floods are terrifying common disasters that kill lots of people and thus get remembered in cultural narratives. The fringe answer is maybe, perhaps not a literal worldwide flood, but some catastrophic event or series of events that seemed world-ending to the people experiencing it, that disrupted civilizations across a wide area, that got remembered and mythologized and eventually transformed into the flood story we find in texts. The Black Sea deluge around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea breaching catastrophically into the Black Sea basin, would have been exactly the kind of event that could generate flood myths. Sudden, devastating, transforming entire regions, killing thousands, destroying settlements, seeming like divine judgment to survivors. Similarly, rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age would have flooded coastal settlements over centuries, slow by geological standards but rapid by human generational standards, creating cultural memory of lands lost to rising waters. The resolution of divine conflict involves compromise that reflects sophisticated political theology. Enlil doesn't get to eliminate humanity, but he does get population controls, increased infant mortality, women who can't conceive, women who lose children, women dedicated to temples who don't reproduce, mechanisms that keep human population below the threshold that annoys divine sensibilities. Enki doesn't get humanity free from divine oversight, but he does preserve their existence and ensures they retain enough capability to fulfill their labor functions while continuing to survive and develop. Both gods compromise, neither gets everything they want, and the result is a system that keeps humans existing but constrained, productive but limited, useful but not threatening. This is remarkably sophisticated political philosophy dressed in mythological language. The idea that governance requires balancing competing interests, that absolute victory is usually less stable than negotiated compromise, that sustainable systems require multiple power centers checking each other rather than unified authority that becomes tyrannical. The joke that keeps surfacing is obvious. What do the Anunnaki and human managers have in common? They both initially thought eliminating the workforce was a solution until they realized they'd then have to do the work themselves. Actually, speaking of divine-human relationships, there's genuine scholarly interest in what texts call the burden of the gods, the labor that supposedly burdened divine beings before humanity was created to assume it. What work exactly were gods performing? Texts mention digging irrigation canals, which makes sense if gods are metaphors for the natural forces that create waterways, but less sense if we try to imagine literal divine beings with shovels. Unless, as some researchers suggest, the burden of the gods refers to the actual work of establishing civilization, the planning, supervision, organization, and knowledge work required to transform Neolithic villages into urban centers, work that presumably the Anunnaki performed directly in early generations, but that they wanted to delegate to humans once humans became capable of it. In this reading, human creation and education isn't primarily about finding agricultural workers, but about developing a species capable of managing its own civilization under divine oversight, rather than requiring constant hands-on divine management. The conflicts between Enlil and Enki continue throughout Sumerian mythology, taking different forms in different periods. Sometimes they're fighting over which city should hold political supremacy, Nippur for Enlil, Eridu for Enki. Sometimes they're arguing about specific humans. Enlil wants to punish, Enki wants to protect. Sometimes the conflict is subtle, expressed through competing religious practices or rival priestly traditions. The persistence of this divine rivalry suggests it represented something important to Sumerian culture, something unresolved, some fundamental tension that couldn't be eliminated but had to be managed. Modern scholars see this as reflecting actual political tensions between North and South Mesopotamia, between agricultural and mercantile interests, between conservative and innovative factions, between central authority and local autonomy. The gods serve as cosmic representatives of human factions, their conflicts in heaven paralleling and legitimizing conflicts on earth. Another major conflict that shapes Mesopotamian mythology involves Inanna, the goddess of love, war, sex, political power, and morning, evening star, basically everything dramatic and intense and slightly dangerous that makes life interesting. Inanna isn't content with the traditional divine role of passive reception of worship. She actively seeks power, authority, and supremacy over other deities. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, she gets the god of wisdom drunk and tricks him into giving her the me, those fundamental civilizational principles we discussed earlier, transferring them from Eridu to her city Uruk and making Uruk the political capital of Sumer. In the descent of Inanna, she ventures into the underworld ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, attempting to expand her authority even into the realm of death, and nearly gets permanently stuck there until rescued through Enki's intervention. Inanna represents ambition, the refusal to accept assigned roles and limitations, the drive to exceed boundaries, and her mythology reflects cultural anxieties about ambition, about women with power, about the dangers and attractions of boundary transgression. The gender dynamics of divine conflicts reveal fascinating cultural attitudes. Male gods like Enlil, Enki, and Anu occupy official leadership positions and claim ultimate authority, but female goddesses like Inanna, Ninhursag, and Ereshkigal wield real power through intelligence, sexuality, control of life-giving and death-dealing forces, and simple refusal to be sidelined. The texts never quite resolve whether female divine power threatens or complements male divine authority, reflecting similar ambiguities in human gender relations. Priestesses held significant religious authority in Sumerian culture. The Entu priestess, highest female religious office, was often a king's daughter, wielding political influence through religious position. The Naditu women, consecrated to gods and forbidden to marry or bear children, managed temple estates and engaged in business, accumulating wealth and power outside traditional female roles. Divine conflicts between gods and goddesses map these human tensions about gender, power, and proper social roles. The conflict between gods and humans, not just between gods about humans but actual human challenge to divine authority, appears most dramatically in the Tower of Babel tradition, though that's technically a later Hebrew adaptation of Mesopotamian material. But the underlying theme appears in earlier Sumerian sources: humans becoming too capable, too ambitious, threatening to bridge the gap between mortal and divine, and gods responding by limiting human potential. The confusion of languages at Babel is punishment for attempting to build a tower reaching heaven, for trying to make themselves like the gods. This theme of divine jealousy protecting divine prerogatives shows up repeatedly. Gods don't want humans to become too wise, too powerful, too independent. Prometheus stealing fire for humanity gets punished not because fire itself is wrong, but because it represents knowledge that elevates humans closer to divine status. The tree of knowledge in Eden gets forbidden not because knowledge is evil, but because knowing good and evil makes humans like one of us, threatening the hierarchy that separates mortal from divine. The resolution of divine-human conflict involves establishing permanent separation and hierarchy. Humans get to exist, even to flourish in limited ways, but must always remember their subordinate position. They must provide offerings, perform worship, build temples, follow divine law, accept their cosmic role as servants even when individual humans might achieve high status within human society. The gods maintain their superior position through monopoly on immortality. Humans must die, must remain temporary, must never achieve the permanence that characterizes divine existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores this theme extensively. The hero Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, seeks immortality after his friend Enkidu dies, journeys to find the secret of eternal life, actually obtains the plant that grants immortality, but then loses it to a serpent through momentary carelessness, learning that human mortality is inevitable and must be accepted rather than overcome. The message is clear. Humans might achieve great things within their mortal span, but they cannot transcend their essential nature, cannot become gods, must accept the limitations built into their existence. The conflicts shaping this cosmic order reflect psychological sophistication that moderns often underestimate in ancient peoples. The gods aren't simply powerful, they're complex, contradictory, capable of wisdom and foolishness, mercy and cruelty, cooperation and conflict. They model the full range of human psychological dynamics, projected onto cosmic scales but recognizable as fundamentally human patterns. Which raises another question. Are the gods anthropomorphized projections of human psychology, or do the texts describe actual entities whose psychological complexity is being genuinely recorded? If we take the texts as purely mythological, then yes, obviously they're human psychological projection. But if we entertain the possibility that something real underlies the mythology, then maybe what seems like anthropomorphization is actually accurate description. Maybe the Anunnaki, whatever they were, did have complex psychologies with internal conflicts and contradictory motivations and capability for both constructive and destructive action toward humanity. As darkness settles completely over the Mesopotamian landscape in our imagination, the conflicts that shape this world become less visible but no less real. In temple courtyards, priests argue about proper ritual practice, each claiming divine sanction for their interpretation. In city councils, officials debate resource allocation, invoking different gods to support different priorities. In family homes, people pray to different deities depending on their needs. Enki for wisdom, Enlil for agricultural success, Inanna for protection in warfare or success in love. The divine conflicts that texts describe in cosmic terms play out in miniature in every human interaction, where competing authorities, competing values, competing visions of proper order come into tension. The genius of Mesopotamian theology is that it doesn't resolve these conflicts into neat harmony, but acknowledges that conflict is fundamental, ongoing, requiring constant negotiation and compromise rather than final victory for any single principle or authority. The gods fight and the cosmos continues. Humans suffer from these conflicts, benefit from them, learn to navigate them, and maybe that's the real wisdom the Anunnaki taught. Not that divine authority brings perfect order, but that order emerges from managed conflict, that civilization requires balancing competing forces rather than eliminating them. The empty epoch ends not with certainty, but with questions that proliferate the more carefully we examine the evidence and the texts and the gaps between them. We've journeyed through imagined spaces and historical fragments, through archaeological sites and mythological narratives, through scholarly debates and fringe speculations, trying to understand what existed before the gods descended, and what happened when they arrived, and what all of this might mean for our understanding of humanity's origins and early development. The truth, as always, is complicated, contradictory, impossible to reduce to simple conclusions or confident pronouncements. The ancient Sumerians looked at their world and saw gods everywhere, in storms and rivers, in the growth of crops and the movements of stars, in the structures of their society and the purposes of their existence. They created or recorded or preserved mythology that explained their world in terms that made sense to them, that provided meaning and purpose and cosmic justification for the way things were. Modern scholars look at the same evidence and see human cultural evolution, technological development, social organization, religious imagination, creating elaborate theological systems to answer existential questions and legitimize power structures. Between these interpretations lies vast territory that we've explored tonight, territory where certainty dissolves and possibilities multiply, where the boundary between history and mythology becomes permeable and unstable, where we have to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to comfortable conclusions. Did the Anunnaki exist as literal divine beings who descended from the heavens to establish civilization? Probably not, if we're being honest about what literal divine beings means in a materialist universe. Did something happen in the transition from Neolithic villages to Sumerian civilization that the myths are trying to describe, some discontinuity or acceleration or influence that shaped human development in ways we don't fully understand? Maybe. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, interesting but not definitive. What we know for certain is limited. Southern Mesopotamia underwent rapid cultural development between 4000 and 3000 BCE, transforming from scattered agricultural settlements into the world's first urban civilization, with writing, monumental architecture, complex social hierarchies, sophisticated religious practices, and technological innovations that would influence human history for millennia. The Sumerians themselves attributed this transformation to the Anunnaki, divine beings who descended from heaven to teach civilization and establish cosmic order. Their texts describe these events with specificity that goes beyond vague mythological generalities, naming specific gods, specific cities, specific innovations, specific conflicts, creating a coherent narrative that was clearly important to their understanding of themselves and their place in the cosmos. The mainstream interpretation treats this as mythology and focuses on material evidence of human cultural development. The alternative interpretations ask what kernel of historical reality might underlie the mythology and suggest various possibilities ranging from cultural contact with more advanced human populations to more exotic scenarios involving non-human intelligence or actual divine intervention. The empty epoch that preceded divine descent represents something psychologically important, a time of innocence, of existence before cosmic purpose was imposed, of humanity not yet burdened with divine expectations and obligations. In this reading, the descent represents loss as much as gain. Yes, humans acquired civilization and all its benefits, but they also acquired limitations, hierarchies, obligations, the weight of serving purposes not their own. This ambivalence appears in multiple mythological traditions. The Garden of Eden is paradise until knowledge brings awareness and obligation. The golden age of Greek mythology ends when Zeus establishes divine order. The dreamtime of Aboriginal Australian mythology represents a perfect world before human separation from the eternal. Maybe the empty epoch functions similarly in Sumerian thought, not just a period of underdevelopment, but a lost state of simpler existence before complexity and conflict became unavoidable. The architectural monuments we explored, temples and ziggurats rising toward heaven, establishing connection between divine and human realms, represent humanity's most ambitious attempt to reach beyond its limitations, to create meeting places with whatever transcendent reality might exist. Whether you interpret these as purely symbolic structures facilitating human religious practice or as actual functional architecture designed for literal divine-human interaction, they reveal something essential about human nature. We build toward what matters to us. We create physical expressions of our deepest values and beliefs. We refuse to accept the world as merely material, but insist on carving out sacred space within it. The Anunnaki, whether real or imagined, inspired humans to create something magnificent that lasted thousands of years and still moves us when we encounter ruins or reconstructions, or even just photographs of what remains. The conflicts between gods that we examined reveal sophisticated political and psychological understanding. The Sumerians didn't imagine perfect divine harmony, but recognized that power creates conflict, that competing interests require negotiation, that authority needs checking by counter-authority to prevent tyranny. Their gods fight, compromise, cooperate, betray, protect, and punish, the full range of political dynamics that characterize human governance projected onto cosmic scales. This isn't primitive mythology, but mature political philosophy expressed in religious language, acknowledging that sustainable order emerges from balanced competing forces rather than unified authority. Modern political theory reinvents these insights using secular language, checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism, pluralism, but the fundamental recognition that power must be distributed and competed for to prevent abuse is already present in 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian mythology. The question of what we owe to the past, to these ancient people who created the foundations of civilization, has no simple answer. We owe them recognition that they were fully human, as intelligent and capable as we are, working with the knowledge and tools available to them to create meaning and order in a confusing world. We owe them humility about our own certainty, acknowledging that future generations will look at our confident pronouncements about reality with the same mixture of respect and skepticism that we direct at their mythology. We owe them curiosity rather than dismissiveness, willingness to take their accounts seriously even when they describe events and entities that don't fit our materialist assumptions. We owe them the effort to understand their worldview on its own terms before judging it by ours. And maybe we owe them recognition that some questions they asked, about humanity's purpose, about our relationship to whatever transcendent reality might exist, about how to create and maintain just social order, remain unanswered despite all our technological advancement and accumulated knowledge. The empty epoch that opened our journey tonight reminds us that there was a time before all our stories, before all our certainties, before all our elaborate explanations and theories and frameworks for understanding reality. There was a time when humans existed without knowing they were supposed to serve anyone, without organized religion demanding worship, without cosmic purpose imposed from above. Whether that time was better or worse than what followed depends on what you value: the freedom of meaninglessness versus the burden of cosmic significance, the simplicity of survival versus the complexity of civilization, the innocence of not knowing versus the weight of knowledge and obligation. The Anunnaki's descent, whether historical or mythological, represents the end of that empty time and the beginning of everything that makes us recognizably human: language, writing, architecture, art, law, organized religion, political structures, technological innovation, all the achievements and atrocities that characterize civilized existence. As you drift toward sleep tonight, letting the images and ideas from this journey blur and fade into the darkness behind your closed eyes, maybe let yourself sit with the questions rather than reaching for answers. Maybe let the empty epoch represent something valuable, not a historical period to be accurately defined and measured, but a psychological space of not knowing, of possibility, of existence before categorization and explanation. Maybe let the Anunnaki represent whatever they need to represent for you: gods or aliens or metaphors or historical humans or pure imagination, without needing to commit to certainty about which interpretation is correct. Maybe let the conflicts we explored remind you that tension and contradiction aren't problems to be solved but fundamental features of existence to be navigated, that wisdom lies not in eliminating conflict but in learning to live with it constructively. The temples rising toward heaven in your mind's eye represent human aspiration, the refusal to accept limitation, the insistence on reaching toward something beyond material existence even when reaching is all we can do and grasping remains impossible. The Sumerians built ziggurats, knowing gods wouldn't literally walk down the steps, just as we build cathedrals knowing prayers don't physically travel to heaven. Just as we reach toward understanding, knowing complete certainty remains forever beyond our grasp. The reaching matters more than the grasping, the building matters more than the arrival, the questioning matters more than the answering, and maybe that's what the empty epoch teaches us finally, that the space before certainty, before imposed meaning, before explanations harden into dogma, is valuable precisely because it remains open, undefined, full of possibility. The ancient clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform are silent now, their messages decoded and debated and discussed by scholars who will never agree on what they ultimately mean. The temples are ruins, the ziggurats eroded by time and weather and human conflict. The Anunnaki, whether they ever walked among humans or existed only in imagination, have departed, leaving behind only questions and interpretations and the civilization they supposedly founded. We inherit this legacy, these stories, these structures, these questions about our origins and purpose and relationship to whatever transcendent reality might exist beyond material existence. We inherit the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the need to make meaning in a universe that doesn't provide clear instruction manuals or definitive answers. So sleep well tonight, knowing you're part of a continuity stretching back to those first humans pressing wedges into wet clay, recording their understanding of cosmic order, creating meaning through language and architecture and ritual practice. Sleep knowing that the questions that kept them awake still keep us awake, that the mysteries they contemplated remain mysterious despite our accumulated knowledge. Sleep knowing that the empty epoch exists not just in the past but in every moment of not knowing, every space between certainty and confusion. Every instance when we realize how little we truly understand, despite how much we claim to know. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become the primordial void before creation, the empty time before divine descent, the blank page before the first word gets written. Let your consciousness fade into that emptiness, that potential, that space of infinite possibility that precedes all knowing and all being. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time and mythology and scholarly debate and imagination. If you genuinely enjoyed this deep dive into humanity's oldest mysteries, if you found value in sitting with uncertainty rather than rushing toward comfortable conclusions, then consider subscribing and supporting this kind of content, but only if it truly speaks to you. I'm not interested in building audience through obligation or guilt, only through genuine connection with people who appreciate this particular approach to history and mythology and the questions that haunt human consciousness. Sweet dreams, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams vivid, and your rest complete. Tomorrow will bring new questions, new explorations, new opportunities to wonder at the mysteries that remain despite our best efforts to explain them. End of script. Sweet dreams.